50% tariffs, a direct presidential insult, and the sharpest US trade strike against India in decades. It all started on July 30th. India would face a 25% tariff on steel, auto parts, and chemicals starting August 1st. But that wasn't all. Trump added there would be an additional penalty, a punishment, he said, for India's ongoing purchases of Russian oil and weapons. The announcement came straight from Trump's own social media platform, Truth Social, and the tone was blistering. He began by calling India a friend, but in the very next breath, he pivoted sharply. Their tariffs on US goods are far too high, among the highest in the world. They have the most strenuous and obnoxious non-monetary trade barriers of any country. Obnoxious was a deliberate insult, aimed at a country Washington often calls a strategic partner. It stung all the more because earlier this year, India had already made concessions to try to smooth things over, but it only got worse. They have always bought a vast majority of their military equipment from Russia and are one of Russia's largest energy customers. All things not good. This was no longer just about economics. Trump was framing India's defense posture and energy strategy as acts of strategic disloyalty. Then came one of the harshest lines ever aimed at New Delhi by an American president. "I don't care what India does with Russia. They can take their dead economies down together for all I care." It was personal, not just policy. And it forced an uncomfortable question. Was this the real cost of staying close to Russia? Back in February, Modi had visited the White House in an effort to restart what once looked like a personal alliance. He offered early concessions, cutting tariffs on American goods before even landing in DC. He spoke of shared values, strategic cooperation, and the potential for a reset in relations. But Trump wasn't interested. He showed no warmth, made no gestures of goodwill. Instead, he went straight to demands, calling for India to fully open its agriculture and dairy markets, two of the most politically sensitive sectors back home. For Modi, agreeing would mean facing backlash from one of his most influential domestic constituencies, India's farmers, who make up a massive voting bloc and have already staged nationwide protests in the past over trade reforms. When Modi hesitated, the US held firm. No deal, no trade agreement. The meeting ended with polite public statements, but clear private frustration. Over the next few months, relations quietly soured. Trade talks that were supposed to resume in March stalled. Washington expanded its complaints beyond agriculture, criticizing India's digital tax rules, data localization laws, and restrictions on American tech firms. Meanwhile, Indian officials accused the US of dragging its feet on semiconductor cooperation and defense co-production deals that had been announced with fanfare the year before. By late spring, public patience was wearing thin. US trade officials began hinting that market access issues could have consequences. In India, headlines questioned whether Modi had overestimated his influence in Washington. Behind the scenes, both sides knew they were heading toward a confrontation. The only question was when. In most trade disputes, the initial announcement is the main story. Not this time. The July 30th 25% tariff announcement was just the opening shot. Less than a week later, on August 6th, Trump signed an executive order doubling the rate to 50%. With a stroke of the pen, Indian steel, auto parts, textiles, chemicals, and a raft of other goods went from merely disadvantaged in the US market to priced out almost entirely. Shipments already in transit would be hit upon arrival. Buyers in the US began lining up alternatives in Mexico, Vietnam, and Eastern Europe before the month's end. Washington's public line hardened along with the tariffs. If India wanted relief, it needed to change its strategic behavior shorthand for scaling back Russian oil purchases and opening India's market wider to US goods, especially agriculture and dairy. Senior advisors framed it as a simple choice. India couldn't keep deep ties with Moscow and still expect the full benefits of the US market. This was a direct strike at the core of India's trade relationship with the United States. New Delhi pushed back just as publicly. The government called the measures selective and unfair, pointing out that other large buyers of Russian energy weren't being punished, and emphasized that India would protect its core economic interests. Modi, without naming the US, stressed that his government would not compromise the interests of farmers, livestock rearers, and fisherfolk, a clear reference to Washington's earlier demands. Indian officials also noted that negotiators were close to a resolution before the hike, and that the escalation came from the US side. Markets got the message. The rupee drifted toward its lows, safe haven demand for gold and silver picked up, and exporters in textiles, gems and jewelry and auto components began reworking orders, pricing and delivery schedules. In hubs like Ludhiana and Tirupur, firms started deciding which product lines could survive a 50% duty and which to pause. And US buyers quietly tested alternate suppliers to avoid sudden price spikes. At this point, the obvious question is, why doesn't India just accept America's demands and make this problem go away? There isn't a single answer. It's a mesh of economics, politics, and long-term strategy. To Washington, the fix seems simple. Cut Russian oil, open the markets, end the standoff. But for Modi, those demands aren't just inconvenient. They're politically and strategically dangerous. Cheap Russian oil is a domestic stabilizer. With global energy markets volatile, discounted Russian crude lets India hold down fuel costs, keeping inflation in check and cushioning households and industry. That's not just economics, it's political oxygen. Spike fuel prices and you risk angering millions of voters and jolting the wider economy. Modi's political brand can't afford a public climb down. He has cultivated the image of a leader who doesn't bend to external pressure. Accepting US terms wholesale, especially after such a public confrontation, would look like capitulation. In India's political culture, the optics of standing up to a superpower matter almost as much as the policy outcome. Farmers are a red line. Opening India's agricultural market as Washington wants would collide with one of the most powerful constituencies in the country. The 2020 to 2021 farmers' protests that forced the repeal of agricultural reforms are still fresh. Any move that looks like exposing farmers to foreign competition risks reigniting that fire. And the Russia factor isn't just oil, it's history and hardware. In 1971, during the Bangladesh Liberation War, the Soviet Union backed India when it mattered most, vetoing hostile UN resolutions and supplying critical military support as the US tilted toward Pakistan. That wartime loyalty forged a trust that still shapes India's choices. Today, more than half of India's military inventory is Russian origin, with deep collaboration across missiles, air defense, nuclear energy, and space. You can't unwind that in a budget cycle. Trying to do it overnight would punch holes in India's defense readiness. Finally, strategic autonomy is doctrine, not a slogan. Since independence, India has avoided binding military alliances and balanced multiple major powers to preserve freedom of action. Yielding under pressure wouldn't just alter one policy. It would undercut the core of how India has positioned itself in the world and signal to other partners that external pressure works. From Washington's vantage point, this looks like hedging. From New Delhi's, it looks like survival, economic, political, and strategic. That gap in worldview is exactly why this clash is so hard to resolve quickly. India's ties to Russia aren't just about nostalgia for the 1971 alliance. They're a live, strategic card in today's geopolitical game. Russian oil now accounts for nearly 40% of India's crude imports, sold at prices well below global benchmarks. That's more than just a budget saver. It's a political stabilizer, keeping fuel affordable and inflation under control in a country where energy prices can decide elections. In defense, the depth of Russian integration is hard to overstate. Beyond the S-400 missile systems and BrahMos cruise missiles, Russia supplies spare parts, ammunition, and critical know-how that keep large portions of India's arsenal operational. It's not just hardware, it's maintenance, upgrades, and joint projects that can't be swapped for Western alternatives without years of disruption. This relationship gives New Delhi something powerful: leverage. By keeping Moscow close, India ensures it is never wholly dependent on Washington or Beijing. In a world where alliances shift quickly, that flexibility is both a shield and a bargaining chip. That brings us to the crux of the issue. The 50% tariff escalation by Trump has pushed US-India ties into their most fragile state in over a decade. Publicly, both still use the phrase strategic partners. Privately, trust is eroding fast. India hasn't retaliated with equal tariffs, yet. Instead, it's quietly deepening trade talks with Europe, the UK, Japan and ASEAN, while pushing for new transport and energy corridors that bypass American markets. But none of these can match the US in sheer market size, investment scale, or technological leadership. From Washington's perspective, India is still a key counterweight to China, but one that refuses to take sides. That frustrates US policymakers, especially with Trump in his second and final term. There's no election clock forcing a change, meaning tariffs could last for years if India holds its line. The rift is no longer just about economics. Reports suggest India is delaying or shelving certain US defense purchases in quiet retaliation, a warning that trade pressure could spill over into the security partnership. The question now is simple but urgent. Does India recalibrate under pressure to preserve US market access, or does it accept a long, cool chapter in relations and pivot toward a future where Washington is no longer central to its strategy? Don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for future updates.